Thank you for joining us for this lunch session on the art of the plan, looking ahead at big global trends and how they're going to impact our countries, the countries of all of us represented in this room, and the broader global order. My name is Dan Twining. I run an institute in Washington called IRI, which supports democracy all over the world. It's really very exciting for me as a policy planning alum to be on the stage with really a key set of policy planning directors, strategists from major foreign ministries encompassing 3 continents. Ambassador Nagma Mallick, on my immediate right, is here in New Delhi at MEA. Dr. Peter Berkowitz is the US Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. Monsieur Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil speaks much better English than my French, disappointingly for me, but we're delighted that he's here to talk about the French and the European perspective, along with Hans Christian Hagman, our old friend from Sweden, who is really one of the most incisive thinkers in Europe on major macro global trends. There's a lot to talk about. This conversation could go in several directions. We're looking forward to your involvement and participation. We might just begin by sort of throwing the ball in the air, and maybe I could just begin with asking each of my colleagues to make a very brief set of opening remarks on how they're thinking about the future of the world and how it relates back to their country's perspective. Nagma, please.
So, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. On the issue of how do we see an immediate picture on the future, I would guess, I would think that the future will look somewhat like the past, but mitigated and a bit changed by certain specific factors. Those factors could be demography, trade flows, investment flows, demographic trends, including pandemics, also technology. Today, technology. And now it's increasingly clear, climate change. All of these factors will have a role to play, but I think largely they will mitigate and the picture will look something like it's looked till now. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to briefly raise for your consideration what I think are 2 very important challenges. One concerns the international order. One concerns the domestic orders of the world's democracies. And I think how the world's democracies handle the domestic challenge, or I should say their capacity to handle it deftly and diligently, will be crucial to handling the international challenge. What's the international challenge? Well, I think as many people in the room already appreciate, it's the rise of a great power, specific great power. I think this has crystallized in the consciousness of many countries around the world. In my travels, I've encountered a crystallizing awareness in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, that the rise of China presents a challenge to the free and open international order, but a specific kind of challenge. And I want to make sure to distinguish here between the United States' continuing appreciation for the Chinese people and the great achievement, their great historical achievements. But we see in the China challenge something special. Not merely the ordinary quest for eminence or even preeminence in the international order, but a determination, and I'm happy to speak more about this as we go on, but rather a determination to transform that international order in a way that we are deeply concerned about because we think it erodes freedom. This is connected to a second challenge. This is a challenge that arises within the world's democracies If you look across the world, you see and its democracy specifically, you see a wave of nationalism sweeping across the democracies. This, by the way, certainly includes the United States, UK, France, Italy, Eastern Europe, include Israel, India, Brazil. One could speak about other countries. Now, some people see a fatal tension between democracy and nationalism. I don't think that's correct. That is, it's possible for any given people to look within their traditions and find also justifications for the defense of human dignity and fundamental freedoms. But we should acknowledge that there are tensions. So it seems to me one of the great challenges going forward for the world's democracies to seek a proper balance between the claims of national tradition and the universal claims of human dignity and fundamental rights, because only by achieving the correct balance will we be in a position to deal with the larger challenge to the international order.
Manuel.
We're supposed to discuss what is going to happen in the next decade. That's what the organizers have asked us to do. It actually feels easier to speak about what is going to happen in the next decade than what is going to happen this year. And for instance, it's very hard to predict the results of the US election. And we know that some of these short-term events are going to have a terrific impact on the next decade. But the good thing is that we are not doing predictions in policy planning, at least that's not what we do in France. We are doing policy planning. That is, we look at the trends, we look at the drivers of international politics, and we try to chart paths towards our national interests and towards some kind of international order that fits with this interest. My second point is, very quickly, we too, as Nagma mentioned, look at security issues, at climate, at technology, and I'm happy to go back to that in the discussion. I think one of the things that we try to do also is precisely looking at these deeper, longer-term trends that we see arising. And one thing that we do, for instance, in my policy shop is looking at globalization, which basically is what has shaped our trajectory, our global trajectory since the 90s at least, probably even earlier than that, and look at the kind of backlash that there is right now out of socio-economic concerns, but also out of environmental motives, and clearly also out of national security interest. That's all the discussion about weaponization of interdependence, etc. And so how is that going to evolve, both in our national domestic discussions, but also on the international stage is something that clearly we are looking at. And maybe a third point on exactly to follow up on what Peter was saying about this evolution within the democratic world. I think parts of the challenge will have to do also how this translates in terms of foreign policy. Does this frustration of the people with what they have and thirst for protection or control of their national destiny, will that translate into a quest for more sovereignty that will be opposed to international cooperation, or a quest for sovereignty that will actually fit into and even help build better international cooperation? That's a key challenge, one of the challenges that we are looking at when we do policy planning in Paris.
Hans.
Thank you very much. There was an interesting interview 10 years ago with Henry Kissinger and Hillary Clinton. And they jointly had a fascinating discussion where they differentiated between what issues are immediate, what issues are important, and what issues are long-term. And it's somewhere there, the challenges of trying to differentiate between these three categories. Now, if we just look at the important, are we focusing on the number of lives threatened, either nationally or internationally? Or are we focusing on the expensive threats? Or are we focusing on the existential threats? Or is it the freedom, the political freedom of maneuver, and the most difficult threats, the most challenging, the most controversial threats, which we tend to focus on? The way that I see it, the next 10 years, there are 6 main themes which will more or less permeate all of our thinking. The first is the climate crisis. I'm especially thinking of the consequences. If you do not have air condition, what do you do? The impact on agriculture, the impact not least on Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, on food production, on urban societies, if you have increased heat peaks. I think that'll be a huge challenge, not least when it comes to migration. People will have to move. If you cannot survive, you'll have to move. And with this perhaps happening on a global scale, it will have an impact, not only on trade and on integration in societies, but also how our societies manage change. I think the second biggest factor is China. And it'll be a huge difference if China develops in a harmonious way or in a problematic way. I think we have to have the mental preparedness that China will can develop in very many different ways. We may have an enlightened, strong and confident China, which will act and have priorities in a certain way. Or we will have a China in crisis for whatever reason, whether it's political, internal crises, or water, air, food security issues, or financial issues, or just because of China reacting to decoupling. Or we'll have something in between. But it will have an impact on Chinese investments in research and development, in the PLA, in Chinese military thought, depending on how China develops. The third factor, as I see, is US-China relations. Huge impact for the rest of the world. Whether there is a long-term agreeing to disagree, a strategic understanding, but competing in the economic sphere, or if we're moving towards a strategic rivalry, either with blows being fought, or more under the radar. It will have a huge impact. The fourth element is a more continental Europe. After Brexit, and Europe being more dominated by France and Germany, it will change how Europe sees the world, how Europe acts in the world. Europe has a couple of superpowers. It is a normative superpower, and it is a trade superpower. How will it use that force internationally for good, for managing long-term challenges, and how focused will it be on its internal rearranging of its deck chairs? The fifth element is technology. Already in Silicon Valley, they're talking about the fifth industrial revolution, focused on synthetic biology, quantum computing, and advanced AI. We're barely into the fourth industrial revolution, but we're already moving and thinking about the next step. That will have a profound effect. And in the sphere of technology, it's a G2 world. It's all about China and the US. And the impact this will have on security, on warfare, on innovation and competitiveness, and the haves and have-nots, on equality issues, and on the capacity to manage the global strategic issues, which are climate change, antimicrobial resistance, which honestly kills 7 times more people than all the world's armed conflicts, but also on how we manage our urban societies. And finally, on the sixth issue, it's global values and the shift in global values. the global norms, global standards? Are there still universal values, or are there slight nuances? And this is not just the rise of China. It is India having a greater voice. It is countries such as Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey having stronger voices. And I fear that we're moving towards a world, 100 world, where we'll have 100 different coalitions on 100 different issues with 100 different kinds of rules. And that'll be a world which will be very difficult for small and medium-sized countries to navigate in, who are very comfortable when we have universal standards, universal norms, and global rules, and not this piecemeal and fragmented rules. And I fear that if we have a more fragmented world with fragmented rules, fragmented norms, it would be less suited to challenge the true challenges, which are the climate crisis, which are the non-communicable diseases, which is managing scarce resources, oceans, water resources. And thanks.
Okay, thanks, super, Hans. That was such a nice discussion to set the table so that we can dive in a little bit. Before we dive into the issues my four colleagues have laid out and try to unpack them, I would like to just start with Nagma and ask about your process. How do you get grip on these issues as a planner? What kind of inputs, what kind of metrics? How do you turn forecasting into something that is relatable to the policy realm in the near term, please?
You know, when I mentioned when I said the past is the future, I want to mention here some interesting figures, statistics. From the 1st to the 11th centuries, India's share of world GDP ranged from between 32 to 29%. India's share of the world's GDP. In the year 1700, India's share of the world's GDP was 24.4%, higher than the combined Europe's 23.3%. These figures are sometimes, they're forgotten. So, similarly, in the year 1700, at the same point, when India's share of the world GDP was 24.4, China's was also around the same, 25%. So in that sense, the rise of China and the rise of India today is not something so new or unusual. It was foreshadowed by what has been the norm in the world for 1,000 years previously. So this is why I say that these trends tend to repeat. Similarly, when we consider, these are things that we certainly look at when we do our analyses and when we, as my good friend Manuel here said, we too are very, very wary of making predictions, but I can say that these are the tools we use in just forecasting general trends. Similarly, when we look at a country like Russia, Russia has a history of independent action. It has been, for the past several hundreds of years, a strategic, military, and intellectual pole separate from the Western liberal order. Now, it's not likely that that will suddenly change. So that is also something that is likely to continue. On technology, I just want to say two quick things. These are the things that we look at. Demographic trends I mentioned earlier, but that too with a nuance. Of course, it will make a long-term difference to the geopolitical heft of a country if the population is going downwards sharply. But then that is also sometimes mitigated by many other factors. So, we can't take that too much into account either. On technology, I want to quote, a classic example from the past of how technology influenced geopolitics. The decision by the Royal Navy to convert its ships from running on coal to oil in 1912. The subsequent carving up of the post-World War I West Asia region into mandates, the British mandate, French mandate, they were carved up into these mandates to be governed by one or the other victorious power. You can see that can be directly traced to that decision to switch from coal to oil. And I would say the developments in that region to this day are a consequence of that global move to oil, the global move that came. Today's example that I think applies to all our countries, but I know it certainly applies to India. The rise of the internet and social media. their influence on domestic politics, electoral outcomes, law and order, and so many other things. Today, I understand that there are nearly 500 million smartphones in India. Nearly 500 million smartphones in India. And this is a trend not just in India, but it is seen in countries around the world. The majority of people today get their news. The primary source of news for most people today is their smartphone. Sometimes just Twitter, sometimes other social media. So it is smartphones today. You can understand public opinion is shaped by this news consumption. And this news consumption and this public opinion, consequent public opinion, will obviously shape decisions. So these are the things that we need to look at today, how technology is influencing geopolitics today. And one final word on the things that we take into account. Sometimes there are important swing moments. One country decides something, and that makes a difference to everyone. And in that respect, I'd like to highlight here to my colleagues the decision that independent India, made directly after independence to opt for parliamentary-style, Westminster-style democracy. I believe that had a big difference in how the newly independent countries of Asia and Africa, I believe that played a role in the decision of many of these countries to opt for democracy. So in that sense, India's decision at that time has made a big difference in the geopolitics of the period of the decades directly after the Second World War. These are the things.
Okay. Does anyone else on that? Peter, and then Hans.
Just a quick comment. I'm actually a relative newcomer to the State Department. I've been very impressed by my colleagues' professionalism and knowledge. We use all sorts of tools. We study data, we study economics, we study political systems. We attempt to bring it all together in the policy planning staff. But there is, I think, a place for improvement in how we do our work. And I was delighted to hear you invoke on several occasions history. I think we can actually, we the United States can do a better job by immersing ourselves more deeply in the study of the history, the cultures, the languages of all the many countries that we deal with. I should emphasize this will enhance the work that we already do. It's not in contradiction to it. It will be a very useful supplement.
Hans.
Thank you. Just take up a little bit where Peter left off. I think that when we, as a small country, try to assess power in the world, we have to try to focus not only on history, legacy, tradition, our own paranoia, and so forth, which we all have. So the parameters which we tend to focus on is, first of all, size. Economic size matters. Population size matters because it gives legitimacy. It gives weight. Size in trade also has an impact, but maybe more importantly, in investments. If you come with a big bag of money, you have influence. But maybe more importantly is the quality of education, the size of investments when it comes to research and development, in innovation, in patents. That is super important. Naturally, if you have resources, that's a good thing to have. If you have a society which is functioning, levels of corruption, access to infrastructure, functioning laws, and so forth. And then naturally hard security, which is perhaps the easiest to focus on the hard kit. More difficult, the operational capability, the expeditionary capability, what you have. And not least when it comes to the asymmetric elements. It's not just the aircraft carriers and the submarines and the tanks and the aerial vehicles. It's what you can do with it. It makes all the difference in the world. But finally, also if you have a seat at the table, and if you have the soft power, the allure, the attractiveness, if you have the tourists, or if you are a tourist destination, if you can win the hearts and minds of countries, And then we get back to the history. If you have the culture, is a power. But it's all of these factors together, which you have to have some kind of equation, depending on how you weigh them, which delivers power. And today, I do feel that it is very much a G2 world. It is the United States and China, which are completely dominant. And then we have a second category, which is Europe and India and Japan and a few of the others. And then we have smaller countries, which do not deliver when it comes to innovation, investments, when it comes to military power or soft power. Thanks.
Okay, Manuel, I'm going to see if I can get the Europeans to disagree. And I just want to draw you out on this question of the future of Europe. Asia is returning to the center of world politics, a position it did once hold, as you suggest, several centuries ago. Really, for centuries, Europe was the center. We could argue that, in fact, Europe has the biggest economy. It's the trading superpower of the international system. It's a regulatory superpower that is exporting ideas about things like data privacy, about climate protection, other things. Part of this comes down to Hans's point about how do we think about power and influence in the world of the next decade. And could you give us a French or a European perspective on the future of Europe in this equation?
Yeah, I don't think I disagree with Hans on that one. First, some of the reasons why we've been at the center of the world were not that good, including for us ourselves. If you think only of the 2 world wars, that's a good enough reason not to want to be necessarily at the center of the world. What we want is to have a seat at the table and to be able to, as I mentioned, have some control over what is happening to us. The thing is, we live in that globalized world, and I don't think it's totally able to shield yourself from this interdependence that we have. Climate is a major example. There are many others. Terrorism, global pandemics, you can think of many of them. And so if you can't shield yourself from the rest of the world, then you need to be interested in the rest of the world, and that's what we are doing. I'm not sure all the reasons why Asia is slowly but surely shifting to be the center of the world are all necessarily positive reasons in terms of world stability and cooperation. And so that's what we would be looking at as Europeans, and that's how we would look at our power. When European leaders say they want a more geopolitical Europe, that is basically the recognition of this, of the fact that it's not just about how you promote prosperity and cooperation. That's still what we want to do ourselves, and that's still the basics of the European model, of the European project. But that is not all that there is in international politics right now, and so we need to be able to weigh in on world affairs on those other dimensions.
Thank you. Peter, I'm curious for an American perspective on this argument about an emerging G2 world. Personally, I find it slightly worrisome. One of the great differentiators of the United States in the world is the fact that we have a global network of allies. We don't want to decouple from them. On the other hand, I think there is a lingering concern in Washington that not all of our allies are thinking as far ahead as maybe we are about the nature of the China threat, the competition. Could you just comment on this?
Sure. Actually, I think especially in the last year or two in Washington, we've been pleased to see that more and more of our allies, more and more of our partners are in agreement with us about the seriousness of the China challenge. I found that in speaking to Europeans. I found that in speaking to people from the vast Indo-Pacific region and the Middle East as well. So we do have that recognition. Moreover, I believe that the United States has actually demonstrated both in speeches and deeds just how important to us are our allies around the world, not least here in the Indo-Pacific region. I think, for example, that the United States is responsible for the most foreign direct investment in this region. Also, foreign aid, I think we lead on. I think the Trump administration has increased by 25% the amount of aid given to the Indo-Pacific region over the last 3 years. So I believe the United States right now is under no illusions. There is no way to preserve the free and open and rules-based international order that we all talk about, that so much blood was spilled to create, that so much effort has been given to maintain since World War II. We recognize it can't be preserved without friends and partners in every region of the world.
Thank you. Okay, Nagma. India and China, as you mentioned, had similarly scaled economies once upon a time. In fact, they had similarly scaled economies until maybe 25 years ago, when the Chinese really jumped ahead for all sorts of reasons. 10 years from now, I think the American, European, Western vision is of an Asia that is pluralistic, that has a strong China, a strong India, a vibrant and autonomous Southeast Asia, etc. I'm not sure that's the view in Beijing. The view in Beijing, I would argue, is that in 10 years, China will be the dominant actor in this region. And I don't want to call you out on this too much, but I would like to understand from an Indian perspective, is there enough strategic space for India to have its own version of a global rise, which we all expect it to have, given these new dynamics in Asia and China's current lead?
Yeah, thanks. Yesterday, my minister, in his question answer session in the main hall, he mentioned that it's a remarkable contemporary development that China and India have risen at the same time, in the same compressed space of time, as you said. Yes, there is a difference, of course, in the quantum of growth. China has grown faster than India. It is clear, there is no doubt about it, the rise of China and all its associated developments around it and the resistance that it is now revoking, this constitutes together probably the single biggest geopolitical change since the end of the Cold War. There's no denying that, of course. What we see in the next 10 years, you know, to our mind, the Chinese growth trajectory will be different from the growth trajectory, for instance, of the Soviet Union, because you know, the way they have positioned themselves is differently. We feel that it is a possibility that China will face headwinds in the time to come. We have seen that there is a certain contestation that is there already. The US-China trade war is one example of that contestation. We saw with the signing of the phase 1, there is an agreement on some things yesterday, but still there are many things that are yet to be resolved, so this is going to take some time. I think what will happen, or what can happen, is that some kind of a cost-benefit analysis will probably force itself upon China. I think a lot of the things that the Chinese are doing right now, the funding, the infrastructure, development, all of that, perhaps they will recalibrate some of them on the basis of a more clearly economic rationale. This is what I can see for the next 10 years. India, we have in place, you know, many economic steps. This government, Prime Minister Modi's government, has taken many economic steps. There are ups, there are downs, we don't deny that. But I do believe that we are on track to attain the objective of a $5 trillion economy by the year 2025. So in the next 10 years to come, I think there will be some recalibration, and it will not look exactly like the way it has looked till now.
Okay, Manuel, can I draw you out on the question of China's relations with Europe? I was once in a meeting in China. I was the only American. It was a group of Europeans speaking with a senior Chinese official who said he didn't understand there were any Americans in the room. I kept silent. He said, I want to tell you a secret, you Europeans, since there are no Americans in the room. The Belt and Road is about building a special relationship between China and Europe, because we think the Americans have monopolized the Europeans too long. And we want our own special relationship with Europe. What does this mean for European unity. We've seen the 16+1 and other fissures that have divided Europe in terms of Chinese engagement. We've seen major Chinese strategic investments in port and other facilities and infrastructure that are creating different economic incentives in member states that are complicating EU comity consensus on the issue of China. Could we just draw you out? What does this look like in 10 years?
So I think the 16+1 now, 17+1 is a good example of how Europeans have evolved recently on that. The notable evolution is not that Greece joined the 16, making it 17, but the notable evolution is that most, if not all, 17 countries realized that actually what they gained from that format was not that obvious. And more generally, I think Europeans have realized that maybe they had been a bit naive about China rise. A good example of that is trade. Some Europeans, clearly not France, but some Europeans usually believe that even if China is not behaving as a market economy, we should still behave according to the free trade canonic rules, because, well, that's too bad for China that they are not doing it, but free trade is good for us, so let's do it. And then you see that the fact that China is not competing by the rules, is not playing by the rules, actually because of its size, because of the way it behaves, etc., is not good, not just for China, but for us too. And so there is a change in European reaction to that, vis-à-vis that situation. The embodiment of it being a European Commission document, strategic document, calling China a strategic competitor and drawing a number of policy consequences, for instance, in terms of screening foreign investment, not just Chinese investment, foreign investment in general. But that came from thinking about the way China behaves. What is interesting there is that you have this situation where I would say Europe, to stick to the trade example, Europe basically shares most of the US assessment about the problems with China's economic behavior. What we don't agree with is the way you answer to that. Part of the problem is that we are not convinced that dealing with this bilaterally is the solution, if only because it's probably good to have a bilateral trade deal, including just the phase one of a deal that settles your own bilateral issues. But the problem raised by Chinese economic behavior actually also apply in the rest of Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe. And therefore, you want to settle all these issues everywhere on the global market, not just in your bilateral relation. And that's why we have multilateral trade institutions, which are supposedly the one helping you to make this global market leveled. And to do that, you need the WTO institutions, for instance, especially its dispute settlement body, to be reformed, surely, because I think we all agree that it's not working perfectly, but to be reformed, not to be sidelined and pushed away from dealing with these matters. And that's where we have this discussion, I think, strategic discussion for the next decade and probably longer than that, about what kind of approach, even if you agree on the issues, on the challenges, what kind of approach do you favor while addressing them? For us, Europeans, it's important to see that this decoupling issue and the issue of weaponizing interdependence and using economic or market power vis-à-vis others is not just an issue between China and the US. One of the major foreign policy debates in Europe right now is about US sanctions and their extraterritorial dimension vis-à-vis Europe. And obviously, that puts us in a very different position when we have to think about these decoupling issue and how do we deal with interdependence. As I said, the European project is about interdependence. It's about the idea that interdependence is good because it creates prosperity, it's a source of stability, and it can leverage cooperation, which surely is the best way to deal with some of the major challenges that we have now. But if others are weaponizing interdependence and turning interdependence in a vulnerability, then it brings it to a very different question, and it's even more different question when this behavior comes from one of your major ally and the major power that you want to be able to partner with to deal with these global issues.
Okay, thank you. Hans, I would like to come back. I would like to talk about technology for a couple minutes. And I was really struck by your point that in next-gen technologies, we're looking at a G2 world. Could we just talk about the impact that technology will have on governance, on security, on the challenges you laid out in the next 10 years? And are you fundamentally an optimist or a pessimist?
I find technology as one of the few very optimistic elements we have. We will need technology to solve many of the global issues, be it antimicrobial resistance or be it managing the climate crisis. My problem with technology is that we are dependent, to a degree, on China. I think this will be problematic, that if we have huge issues with China on human rights, on South China Seas, on freedoms, on norms and standards, but we will need Chinese investments in R&D, and we will need to work together with China to solve some of the major global problems. And whatever technology China exports to, for example, Africa, will have a huge impact on the environment and on the climate. So China is important. And I'll also add, India is important. So whatever China and India contribute to when it comes to, for example, managing the global strategic issues is hugely important. But let me just get back to technology then. I see technology as hugely disruptive. I fear, for example, that when we look at security, we're too focused on conventional kit. We're not focusing enough on space, on the cyber domain, on the biological domain. And I see what China is doing and investing in these areas is both impressive and frightening. I do see that it's a problem with the Chinese vision of military-civil fusion, of not having any divisions between the public and the private, of the civilian and the military, and having a whole-of-nation approach. Now, that may be impressive if you're going to the moon or Mars to have a whole national mobilization. But when there are such clear connections to security, that is a problem. But the area of, for example, biology and synthetic biology, if you have a different set of ethics, different kinds of rules, you can do a lot more. Now, China is entirely dominant, I would say, in the area of synthetic biology, gene editing, which offers huge opportunities in new materials, in the whole health sector, precision medication, in the pharma sector especially, but also when it comes to managing data. It's all within the sphere of synthetic biology. And if China is dominating in this area and the rest of us are not investing enough, that will be a competitive advantage for China. But also societally, there will be winners and losers within society. Are we adaptive enough within our societies to manage change? Much of technology is exponential. It's moving at a super fast pace. However, coming from government, bureaucracies are not super fast. It takes time to shift bureaucracies, to create new laws, to manage technology. And I fear that governments are in many ways behind the curve and definitely not ahead of the curve. So we're following whatever technologies are being developed by companies, by some states, and also by individuals. And I see this as a problem for governments if we cannot keep pace, if we are seen as conservative and not as relevant while the technology is moving forward. And then we have a few other issues. When it comes to quantum computing, when it comes to space and space mining, for example, and advanced AI, I do not see that governments are on top of this. We are following, but I do see that that will have a strategic impact on whoever is dominant in these spheres. And I fear that Europe is not in the lead, unfortunately, here. But we do need to have massive investments in these areas, otherwise it will be dominated by the United States and China, for good or bad.
Okay, thanks. Peter.
I agree with much of what Hans said, and I just want to add a short comment to it. In one respect, the challenge in regard to technology that we face is no different from other ages. The Industrial Revolution was extremely disruptive and brought great blessings. The recent telecommunications revolution has been extremely disruptive, has brought great blessings. The various revolutions that we're living through now will be very disruptive, bring great blessings. But there is this difference, too, in a way. Technology has never before allowed us to fundamentally transform what it means to be a human being. But through revolutions in biology and chemistry, the technology allows those transformations. What Francis Fukuyama, in a work different from his work on the end of history, called our post-human future as a result of the biological revolutions. Moreover, we should acknowledge this has been true since the summer of 1945, but even more true now. Never before have human beings had a technology that allows them to destroy the world in almost an instant. We have that now, and not only with nuclear weapons, with biological weapons, to a lesser degree with chemical weapons, but also at this point we have the capacity to send the world back to the 18th century through cyber attacks. So to my mind, what this means is the world is actually interdependent as never before, and I think the main question on this may divide the United States and Europe, but it's a divide, as I've mentioned before to Manuel, within the family, is not the fact of interdependence, but how we handle that interdependence.
Thank you. Nagma, I would like to come to the intersection of technology and democracy. And this is quite an interesting conversation to have in India, because India is a technology power in the world, and it's the world's biggest democracy. China, the Chinese government is using digital technologies to construct a total surveillance state. It is exporting that capability. This is not changing what it means to be human, but it's certainly changing what it means to live in society. When a government has total knowledge of your shopping habits, your social relationships, etc., through a total credit score and other sort of Orwellian tactics. India is sort of the inverse of this, right? And so when we think about many of the trends we've been talking about here, can you just discuss India as a democracy, what that means in terms of kind of the plural open society? What does that mean for the tech competition? What does that mean for India's development aspirations? What does that mean for India's potential for partnership in the world? That in fact, the Indian political system is almost the antithesis of this Chinese model.
We pride ourselves on the fact that India is probably the world's most diverse country. There's probably no other single country which has all of these languages and 25 different official languages, so many different religions, different states, 29 states, 28, 29 states, the number changes. In an important sense, Dan, it is India's democracy that has made all of this possible. It is India's democracy that has given a reason to belong, and it has kept our people together, and it is our electoral democracy which is making this vibrant, diversity possible. I cannot comment for other countries. I will speak for my own. The important thing to remember about India's elections, the miracle is that they take place. There were 880 million voters in our last elections. The technology you mentioned, we use electronic voting machines, and I think every election you can understand if we have 800 plus million voters, every election we must be saving 1 or 2 forests somewhere in the world by not using ballot paper. So yeah, that is certainly something that. So what I would say is, what the democracy does for India is that it makes a government that's responsive. Now, when we see, I think my colleague here, Peter, mentioned Manuel mentioned the WTO. And this is something that is important for my government, because in order to meet the aspirations of the people, in order to ensure that the government is truly responsive to the people, we have to ensure that their interests as farmers, as sharecroppers, as members of the urban industrial economy, these things are taken care of. And this is why India plays an important role in multilateral bodies, in WTO. I think all of this comes out of the fact of our being a democracy. I want to just highlight this. In the WTO, only 1/3 of the members of the WTO are developed countries. Another 1/3 are developing countries, and another 1/3 are LDCs. So the WTO, it's a rule-making body. It is the only major rule-making body for the global trade architecture, and that is important, we feel, to ensure that there is fair play for all. So I will say that even in multilateralism, we are committed to multilateralism, and it is under stress today from both mercantilism and nationalism. You see, in India, our nationalistic feeling, it is something that we take pride in and we are happy with ourselves. It in no way detracts from our internationalism. That internationalism is something that we are committed to, and that is visible in our multilateralism. So I would say this complex of factors that go into making our Indian national character, in the way we express ourselves to the outside world, I would say all of these flow from the fact of our being a democracy.
Okay, Manuel, I know you had a comment. I want to ask you one last question, so you can combine them. I also just want to advise our audience that we're going to come to you next. So please get ready with your questions and interventions. I want to ask you, we haven't talked about demographics very much. We're at a strange convergence point in the world, where on the one hand, over the next decade, we're looking out at a world that for the first time in human history will be broadly middle class. This has never happened before in the full spectrum of human history. On the other hand, today we are living in a world that has more refugees on the move than at any point since 1945, which is an extraordinary thing given that Europe and parts of Asia were destroyed in the 1940s. So what does the demographic outlook mean for Europe? Because the reality is that the big demographic drivers in the world are India and sub-Saharan Africa. And India, I think, is going to absorb its own rising demographic because they will want to broadly stay here. In Africa, that's not clear. Many of them are going to want to come to Europe. And so what do we need to do? We haven't talked about Africa at all thus far. Please.
So first I wanted to build upon what my friend Nagma just said about democracy and why it's important. I agree with what Hans said about why global values are one important major issue to determine where we are going. And arguably, the current trend is not that positive. You see the rise of authoritarianism. You see how it has learned from the past, learned its lesson, done its homework, taking advantage, harnessing some of the technologies. So clearly, this is something that we need to focus on. I'm yet concerned with something that I see rising, which is the argument that this is the one and exclusive fault line on the international stage. I think it's a major fault line, and we need to deal with it in a very proper and determined way. But democracy or not democracy is not going to help you to address climate change. And we know that we need to work both with the US and with China and with many others to actually be able to bring with a collective response that will address the kind of adjustments that we need to do in the way we produce our, the way our economy works. On the other hand, even between democracies, there are significant differences, which is obvious, but that's the case, including on some key issues like what do you do in the face of terrorism? Right now, if you look at the discussion between NATO allies and how we deal with, for instance, the situation in the Levant, you can't say that there is absolute agreement in terms of very strategic issues of assessing the threat, where we are now, what is the risk of a resurgence of Daesh or something else than Daesh, but arguably as much of a terrorist threat as Daesh was recently. And last, listening to you, I thought of these arguments that we hear often that authoritarianism has a big advantage over democracy, which is it can plan, which is what we are discussing today for the long term. So hopefully we are here to testify that there is some planning also in democracies. But thinking of climate, for instance, I think climate is a good example of the fact that authoritarian governments are not that good in terms of planning and making the adjustments early on. If you look at the situation in China in environmental terms, I don't think that it's a really good example of the fact that an authoritarian regime is better equipped, more easily determined to make the adjustment and to suffer the cost from these adjustments. And I would argue, for the same kind of reason that Nagma was mentioning in terms of the diversity, the ownership by the people, the fact that you need to respond to your people's concern, etc., that democracy is not that badly fit to do that. Hopefully we'll prove my points in the next decade because the jury is still out. But I think there are arguments to remain convinced on that. On the demographic issue, your point about the middle class rings a bell on something that we've been working on recently, but we've not completed, so I don't have a kind of a clear-cut conclusion. But there is this social unrest ongoing across the globe right now, from Chile to Hong Kong, and you can think of Algeria, you can think of Lebanon, you can think of Iraq, you can think of Sudan. And I think that's a good argument against the democracy fatigue argument, to stick to the democracy thing. And so it doesn't mean that mechanically, I don't believe that mechanically middle class bring democracy, at least certainly not in a very immediate and stable way. But there are aspirations, there are expectations from the people that you can see across the globe. Obviously, it's not because it coincides in time that all these movements mean the same. But I think there is something to it, and that's what we're currently looking at. On the migration point, so yes, the figures that you mentioned of the fact that we are above where we were in 45 are correct. The thing is, the global population has increased quite a lot. And actually, if you look in terms of proportion, it's pretty stable across the century. Obviously, you have some period in time where you have more displacements of persons and migrations, but the proportion is not that different from where we are. And I'm part of those who believe that these are proportions that we can deal with if we are organized adequately, and if we are organized adequately, not just in domestic terms, but also collectively. And that's a big challenge for us Europeans on how we are going to adjust the instruments that we have in terms of freedom of movement, in terms of asylum, in terms of relocation of refugees. But it's not just about refugees, it's about migrants too, in terms of integration of migrants in our society. That's a major challenge for us, clearly. And it's striking how this has become a topic for foreign policy when it was not so long ago mostly a domestic policy topic. So that says something clearly.
Okay, thank you. Peter, and then we're going to turn to the audience.
I want to note that Manuel has made not one but two very important observations about democracy and climate change. The first was early on that democracy will not solve the problem of climate change. I think that's right because of familiar disadvantages with democracy. But the second observation was that democracy also has certain advantages over authoritarian governments in dealing with a problem like climate change, the most noteworthy of which is responsiveness to the will of the governed. And there seems to be, certainly throughout the democracies of the world, including, I want to emphasize, in the United States, a heightened awareness of the challenge of climate change. But if we take the two observations, the hesitation or criticism and the advantage, put them together, I also want to say something similar about the market, about the free market. It's got its disadvantages compared to central planning. But I actually think in regard to climate change, it has decisive advantages, again, drawing on the observation of the heightened awareness throughout the democracies of the world about the about climate change. I suspect somewhere in Texas, in California, in Oklahoma, in the UK, in France, in Sweden, in India, there are teenagers and college students who are right now developing the kinds of batteries that will be able to store the energy of the sun and a host of other innovations that will make them very rich and enable the rest of us to live in a world with a greatly reduced carbon footprint. So I think we have here an argument, both for, this goes back to Hans's point about values, about why we must renew our commitment both to the principles of democracy and the principles of freedom, because they present, combined, the best way to address these transnational challenges.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's turn to you. Who has a question, a comment? Do we have microphones out there? Yes? Okay. Why don't you start with the woman? Yes, just here. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Good day. So my name is Sibulele Walaza. I'm from South Africa. So I'm interested in additional perspectives on what you see as the future of multilateralism. I think Ms. Nagma did touch on it a little bit, but in an increasingly insular world, we spoke about rising nationalisms. Do you see countries investing more in their bilateral relationships, or do you see a future for multilateralism?
Okay, let's take a couple at a time. Could I come here, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Heather Graby from Open Society in Brussels. So you've talked a lot about international cooperation, and that's something which historically has not grown organically. It has to be carefully built, brick at a time, through the work of people like yourselves. And it's also something that governments often find to be quite awkward and politicians find very inconvenient. So you have to overcome a lot of obstacles to it. And the way that it's been built in the past is usually on the basis of positive sum crises that pushed governments to make the necessary compromises to do cooperation with other governments. So which of the trends you've been discussing, which of the drivers will be a positive push towards international cooperation? And here I'm thinking of, for example, epidemics. Communicable diseases, like, for example, avian flu, do tend to create enough of a common interest to inspire collective action. However, some of the others, I would think, definitely will drive them apart, and particularly competition over resources. And when that goes from rare earths and other and indeed metals that are needed for example, the tech industry, and that moves to water, this is clearly going to be a source of conflicts. What's your outlook for how to build international cooperation around these new issues of tech and climate? Will that be fundamentally different from the kind of cooperation infrastructure that was built after the Second World War?
Thank you. Let me take one more. How about Uma over here?
Thank you, Daniel. Salma Bauer from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'd like to thank the panel for the menu of challenges that you've offered us. Let me pick two of them. And one was on, Manuel, you spoke about the recentering. Nagma, you spoke about history, the revival of China and India. And the recentering in Europe brought war. What does that mean for us? Does Asia stand facing a future of confrontation increasingly? And Hans Christian, you mentioned 2 points, technology and global values. So we are moving in a direction of a pluri-value system. And combined with technology where it's not yet defined, the rules of the game are extremely open. If you have a splicing of a gene, a different kind of a population, Heather just spoke about epidemics. Would it make a population stronger? Nobody knows. So, I mean, how the two quick elements required is adaptability and flexibility. As people, as systems and designers, you as the thinkers who influence policy making, I mean, how much are we moving in that direction? And a second thing is, if technology is this game changer, we've heard very little about, the architectures in which we would manage technology. I mean, the hybrid nature of war is already on us. I was on a panel yesterday, we were talking about arms control, but it takes a very little investment to do a cyber attack. And we're not there. We think it's not going to happen to us. As long as it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So, I mean, how future-looking are we? Because this 10-year scenario could be on us tomorrow, and the ecosystem does not have a capacity, basically, to sustain us, even into the next 10 years.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so let me take two more, and then we'll have kind of a final round of comments. Yes, please. In the back and then in the front. Yep. Microphone.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Asanga, Director General of the Institute of National Security Studies from Sri Lanka. I just want to lay a comment and also a question. The comment is, I want to bring Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister, at the Shangri-La Dialogue. He mentioned that China's role need to be accepted. And the biggest problem is not accepting China's role. He mentioned this. And he said, if I evaluate 5G, Chinese 5G, and he has to evaluate all other products in the same way. This is, I'm quoting Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong from Shangri-La. My question is about, now Maldives have subscribed to 5G, Chinese 5G, right? Many other countries are on. So what do you think that the 5G network, would India take up this or the other countries would take up? And a short one on extremism to Manuel. We have faced extremist terror. In Sri Lanka, we lost 250 lives. In France also, many attacks. In the US. Soleimani's death. Now, yesterday you heard from the foreign minister, he mentioned that Daesh is celebrating. How would it sort of affect? Because it will be a rise. And also domestic policies such as taken by leaders, global leaders, including in India, the CAA bill. Would it have rise in extremism, or would it sort of, how would it sort of help? Thank you.
Okay, and last one in the front, please.
I just want to say it's been a pleasure listening to all of you. My question is more general. I think Hans had mentioned 6 points that he thinks are going to shape the next 10 years. I just wanted to know what do you guys think about the smoke screens that will be there that will hamper production, the productivity of the way the world is going? Just a general question, that's all.
Sorry, what do you mean by the smoke screens?
So if Hans had said that there are 6 sort of factors that would sort of dictate where the world is going, if it had to be the most productive for the most number of people or groups of people, what do you think are the smoke screens that governments or groups of people could use that could be sort of, that we've seen in vogue in the past, or some new methods that would come up that could hamper any kind of productivity sort of, that way? I hope you get my question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't all have to answer every question. There's one about the future of multilateralism. There's one about kind of positive drivers of international cooperation on new issues of tech and climate. There's one about the future of conflict in Asia and questions of adaptability and flexibility. There's the 5G question, and then the final one. Nagma, please.
I'll pick and choose, answer the ones that I think that are important for me to answer. On the future of multilateralism, I've spoken already. We in India remain committed to multilateralism. We believe that multilateralism really matters. My foreign minister attended the Alliance for Multilateralism that France and Germany have launched recently in New York. And we have been pillars, I can say, of the multilateral order since our independence, and we don't see that changing. How to build greater international cooperation? You know, I would say that there are built-in to the flow of events, there are built-in drivers that ensure that people and nations need to cooperate. I'll give a small example. I mean, we have seen in the past few years, not just past 5 years, but maybe 10 years, a kind of trend. We have seen that within the US, for instance, we see certain things that reveal a desire on their part for a degree of isolationism, perhaps, military, political, economic, but then their commitment to free enterprise, to innovation, the trillion-dollar companies that they have, all of these itself imposes a requirement to continue engaging in the world, to continue to cooperate with the world. So I think these things are built in. There will always be levers, and there will always be factors that will ensure that countries cooperate for self-interest and for other reasons. Recentering of the world, Asia stands for conflict. I would like to say one thing. In Asia, India plays a special role right now. Last June, in the Osaka G20 summit meeting, on the sidelines of this meeting, I think it was my foreign minister who said this somewhere, that 2 meetings took place on the sidelines. One, RIC, the Russia, India, China meeting. That's a grouping that we have. We meet regularly every year at the foreign minister level. And I think we had a RIC summit meeting. And we had at the same venue a JAI meeting, Japan, America, India. And India is the only country that could conceivably belong in both such diverse groupings. So I do believe that, we are a stable power. We are not in a straitjacket. We belong to different groupings, and we encourage conversations. We encourage dialogue. And so I believe that the role that we play in the world and in Asia, it is indeed, it is a role that encourages the building of consensus and that encourages dialogue. So I can't agree that, Asia is moving towards conflict or something like that. Finally, very quickly, because many others have to speak too, I will say that someone mentioned the CAA, that's the Citizenship Amendment Act that has been passed recently by Indian Parliament. There is a degree of misunderstanding about the CAA. All that the CAA says is that it will give accelerated or fast-track citizenship, Indian citizenship, to those people, specific people from a specific listed number of religious groups who have faced persecution on account of their religious beliefs from 3 neighboring countries. I mean, we know for a fact that there are policies, unfortunately, in those countries that sometimes militate against specific minorities. And all we are saying is those people who have fled persecution from those nations that are already living in India, those who have come here before 2014, all we are saying is that we will give to those people from those minorities accelerated citizenship. And please remember, this does not in any way take away or detract from the citizenship that we offer to people from all religions, from these 3 countries and from others, on the normal, through the normal naturalization path. through the normal naturalization path. 3,000 people have been given citizenship in the last 1 year, of which, last 2 years, I think, of which 560 people were Muslims. So there is some degree of misunderstanding over the CAA. The CAA is I think it should not, a true understanding of CAA should not lead to any rise in extremism. On extremism, I would like to speak a little bit later, after I've given a chance to my other colleagues to speak to on terrorism, if you permit. Okay. Yes, thank you.
We're very short on time. Okay, Peter.
Thank you. Very, very briefly. Multilateralism. The literal meaning of multilateralism is, of course, many-sidedness. I think there's no disagreement among people on this panel that multilateralism is absolutely essential to dealing with the world's challenges. What there is a quarrel over what multilateralism really means. Does it mean, to use a tough term, UN supremacy? Or does it mean a variety of ways, including international institutions, for working with friends and partners on behalf of the preservation of a free and open order? On the question of China, what promotes cooperation? The most solid foundation for cooperation is shared interests. Shared commitment to values helps. But how do you know when you have shared interests? It's actually harder than it might seem. And therefore, I think it's for sure very important in the United States, maybe in other countries as well, for us to renew our efforts at understanding the cultures, the histories, the traditions, and the languages of other countries. It helps us understand better the interests and the values we share. On cyber, I can only say here that I assure you that at least in the United States, considerable sums are being devoted to the cyber challenge, although I also have to acknowledge that we're a long way off from having all the answers, and we remain, as do all the nations of the world, extremely vulnerable to the cyber threat. On the question of 5G, again, the United States welcomes China into the world. China is part of the Indo-Pacific region. We would love to see China cooperating to help preserve the international order. But we are extremely worried about China's role in constructing 5G networks. The reason that we're extremely worried is because the evidence is very strong that both the hardware technology and the software will provide Beijing a direct channel to enormous amounts of data that will threaten individuals' privacy and threaten the national security of their nations. And finally, there was a question about productivity. What hampers it? It's a very complex question. Time is short, so I'll offer a simple answer. The greatest threat to productivity is authoritarianism. The greatest opportunity for productivity is a free, sovereign, democratic nation involved in the international order.
Well said, thank you. Manuel, brief, please.
Yes, I'm trying to think how to be brief on so many good questions. I agree with Peter that the difference is not so much in terms of why is multilateralism important and the vision that we have of multilateralism. And of course, there are differences between the US and Europe, or France, speaking only for my country. For instance, I don't think it's just for France to work together. It's also how to work with those who are not your friends, and yet you face common challenges with them. But I'm sure that the difference between our respective visions is much less than the difference we have with the vision that China, for instance, is developing within the UN, where it's investing quite a lot recently, if only on human rights or international law. And so the question on the future of multilateralism, and I'm very pleased that Nagma mentioned the Alliance for Multilateralism, is also that. It's also about the kind of vision that we have of multilateralism. It's not about defending multilateralism as it exists now. It's also about defending a vision that should prompt for reform within the multilateral system. On the idea that what could be the positive push for cooperation, I don't think that there is such a thing where mechanically, because there is a stake that by nature calls for a collective response, we'll have a collective response. And that's the drama of where we are now. We are now in a moment where we see all those challenges that call for a collective response, and yet the appetite for multilateralism and international cooperation seems to be decreasing. So I don't think there's a mechanical thing there. Hopefully, crisis is therefore not the only answer, because in a number of cases it's a bit too late. And that works for the European Union, not just for global multilateralism too. And so it needs to be about a political argument that you make, and how sovereignty is, which is often understood as your ability to control your territory, your national destiny, and therefore to define the border and the limits of what you control and what others control, should also be understood, because that's what it is, and that's why sovereignty was created, legally speaking, politically speaking, as the ability to actually commit to collective agreements, to enter in relationship with other. In one word, to cooperate. On the architecture for technology, so to be very quick, it's absolutely indispensable, as I see it, for instance, in terms of the cyberspace. If you want something like digital sovereignty, which would be one way to protect yourself from two kinds of monopolies, a state monopoly over technology, which clearly is better for authoritarian politics than for democratic politics, or private monopolies, and we have seen in the recent period some of the disadvantages and problems that come with this. We need some kind of sovereignty in terms of having political control, making political decisions about how we regulate all that. But this kind of sovereignty will exist only if we have a global architecture that promotes a free and open and secure internet. So we have to work at the two level, definitely. And one last word on Soleimani. I'm sure Daesh celebrated after Soleimani was dead. Actually, I'm not so sure that they were very dissatisfied with the way Soleimani and Iran in general has behaved in fighting fighting directly or through proxies in countries like Syria and Iraq. So it's a bit of a one-sided version of the problem. I think what Iran is doing in the region now is certainly not a sustainable response to the challenges posed by Daesh in the region.
Thank you. Hans, last word.
Thank you very much. I see that the next 10 years will be really difficult for government. Market forces are wonderful and they're great, but they're not solving the climate crisis. They're not great for solving global strategic health issues, for example. Governments are needed to do that. But governments have many priorities, whether it's defense or it's aging populations or it's infrastructure, etc. So governments have to make the case that it is worth investing in some of these long-term issues. It's worth the cost here and today in order to have a benefit in 5, 10, 20 years' time. And that takes a lot of courage and a lot of wisdom to do that. But it needs to be done in dialogue with the people. It is worth making the investments for the long-term issues. And that will be a real challenge. If we fail making those investments, we will have a much more difficult world to live in 10 years' time. And finally, do not forget the internal challenges in China. Whatever China does, it is the world's largest economy. It may be twice as large as the US economy in 10 years' time. So when China sneezes, will we catch a cold or will we catch pneumonia? So do not ask for a crisis in China. And I think we maybe have to discuss how to manage China. Is it like a big bank where it's too big to fail? Because China is important, it is big, and we do not want it to fail. We do not want a crisis in China. The PLA is still super big and super strong. We do not want a crisis in China. Thank you.
Okay, please join me in thanking our excellent colleagues for this super conversation. And thanks to ORF, thanks to all of you.